Hey writer, if you're ready to level up, then buckle up. Get your pen and paper ready. It's time for another episode of the Art and Business of Writing podcast.
Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of the Art and Business of Writing podcast, where today I'm joined by author Jeffrey K. Walker. Jeffrey K. Walker is a man of many interesting careers, from being a JAG in the military to serving as an attorney and a professor at colleges and universities. He is an expert in history, and so he writes historical fiction. And today we're going to get together and talk about characters. Not just characters though, but how do you write really great ethnic characters that are accurate, that sound correct, that are, in terms of character development, they're developed well, and they're not a caricature of what a person looks like in real life. I think oftentimes as authors, we get afraid of that. We get afraid to write characters who aren't like us or who don't have our background, our ethnicity, our race, our gender. And we talk about, how do we get over that hurdle? How do we get unafraid to do that? And not just get unafraid to do it, but to do it and do it well with the blessing of the people who we're writing about. And so Jeffrey talks about his process in doing that, and he leaves you with a lot of actionable tips and lots of encouragement to move forward in developing your characters the way you want to. So without further ado, I won't hold you any longer, but this is Jeffrey K. Walker. Hey, Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. So let's dive into your life a little bit. So you're a child of Illinois. What was it like to grow up in the Midwest?
Well, it wasn't just the Midwest. It was a small town in sort of the middle of the cornfields of the Midwest. One of those things that you look back on when you were young, couldn't wait to leave. But when you're older looking back, you sort of, I think, see the good parts of it. I always compare it to my kids, my three kids who grew up mostly as Air Force brats, moving every 2 or 3 years. I lived in the same house from when I was 3 months old till I went off to university at 18. There was a certain amount of sort of nurturing kind of wraparound safety to being in a small town that I was fourth generation on one side, I think fifth on the other. My kids never had that, and we've talked about it over the years. Ernest Hemingway grew up about 80 miles north of where I grew up in Illinois, in Oak Park, Illinois, and he described it as a town of wide boulevards and narrow minds. I'm not sure. It might have been a little harsh, but inside there's probably a nugget of truth. I couldn't wait to get out as a kid, and I don't know. I could never see myself going back, but it was a good place to grow up. You could make a lot of mistakes, and there was a lot of people there to catch you when you fell.
So as a writer, did you ever venture into Oak Park just to check it out?
I've been to Oak Park. I really want to go and do the Frank Lloyd Wright house tour there, but I know Oak Park. I have a brother-in-law from just next door to Oak Park, and know the area of the old inner suburbs of Chicago. I know pretty well. So.
Yeah, like as a kid and adolescent, you were a pretty avid reader. What sorts of books did you find escapism in?
It's funny. I was just talking about this a few days ago about comic books. I wasn't like a Marvel comic book fan, but wow, I just absolutely devoured Classics Illustrated. Do you even know what those are?
No, I don't.
They're comic book cliff notes of classic book. Yes, you get like Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, or I remember one I loved was The Last Days of Pompeii. And there are these classic books that were reduced into condensed comic book form, and I absolutely love Classics Illustrated. But I also was the youngest of 4 kids, and I think both because my parents were probably a little tired and because I had so many other older siblings around, I was reading way older than I should have, material that was probably very unsuitable for me as a child, but it didn't seem to do any irreparable harm. So yeah, it's from a family of readers surrounded by books. I remember reading, I write historical fiction. I remember the first full historical fiction novel I remember reading was James Michener's Hawaii. I think I was maybe 9 or 10. Way age inappropriate. very, very age inappropriate. But by the way, I had an abiding love for James Michener ever since. So my parents allowed me to be a free-range reader, for better or for worse.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I grew up in the same vein. I grew up in a small town, and my parents would get me a library card when I was younger, and I would check out all the books. I was big into astronomy, so I'd read all the astronomy books as a kid, and read
Yeah.
Asimov and all those different things. And then eventually, I found the dictionary to be the most exciting thing in my house because we had one of these old dictionaries that was almost like an encyclopedia slash dictionary. And so like the first half of it would talk about like the presidents and the planets and geography, and then it goes into the actual dictionary itself. So I spent all this time just reading that thing over and over, and it was just the most fascinating thing I could get my hands on.
Yeah, small town libraries were, I wonder if people really understand, kind of like small town newspapers, how important those were to us. My hometown in Illinois had a Carnegie Library. It's still a beautiful building. I was just there in this is summer, back from my mother's funeral, and rolled by the library, and it's still there. I grew up about 3 blocks from that library, and it's the first place I remember my parents allowing me to walk alone. And I think part of the reason was my very beloved Aunt Audrey was the librarian there. I think Mom would probably call ahead and say, "Hey,
Yeah.
Jeff's walking down there." And I still remember that feeling, walking in this beautiful, big, sort of Romanesque style Carnegie Library into the big rotunda, and there, look through the doors and see my Aunt Audrey sitting there at the circulation desk, and I go running up to her. So I think, like you, I have these very wonderful memories, even beyond the reading, of being in a library. So.
Yeah, yeah. So you left Illinois, and you mentioned joining the Air Force. Was that directly after, like once you turned 18, did you go straight into the Air Force?
No, actually, I went up to university at Tulane in New Orleans. So New Orleans, I always say, is my second hometown. I did a lot of growing up in New Orleans, and did a year abroad while I was there at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, which is where I met my wife. And you've met my wife, Kathy, a couple of times now, Chris. So it was after that graduated from university. Kathy and I were married right after graduation, sort of knocked around with a few short-term jobs, and just one day was driving by an Air Force recruiting office thinking, hey, I wouldn't mind flying. I had some aviators in the family from World War II era, and that just is sort of what happened. So I signed up, was recruited as a navigator, and went to officer training school, went to navigator school, flew B-52s, bombers for 5 years, got medically grounded, and the Air Force sent me to law school. So I then spent the rest of my Air Force career, when I retired 20 years, as a judge advocate, as a military lawyer. So it was an interesting career, moved around a lot, had some time overseas, 3 years in Italy. But all in all, I think that was a pretty good. I mean, for somebody who wanted to escape a small town boyhood, I couldn't think of any better way to do it than flying bombers and living overseas. So.
Oh, yes, like every 5-year-old boy's dream.
Well, I grew up with the stories. I had one uncle who was a carrier pilot in the Pacific Fleet in World War II, and another great uncle who was a B-17 and then a B-29 navigator and bombardier in World War II. So I grew up with those stories. So there's sort of a romantic, kind of gauzy romantic view of flying that I discovered once I got into it. It's a lot grittier than I thought it was.
Yeah, and so you've had like an interesting career path. You've done like, the military, the bombers, the judge advocate. What else have you done? Because I was looking at your biography, I was like, man, Jeff's done a lot of really wild stuff.
Yeah, the joke is I can't hold a job. So yeah, 20 years in the Air Force. I retired at 43, which is great. At 43, I get, you start getting paid for waking up every morning and breathing in and breathing out. It's kind of nice. I then started a consulting company with a couple of other retired Air Force partners, which we built and grew. It was fairly successful. After 8 years, I was looking to do something else, so I sold my shares back to my fellow founding partners and took a job as a assistant dean and a professor at St. John's Law School up in New York City, and really, really loved teaching law. I ran international programs for the law school, so I got to travel. Spent half the summer overseas every year in either Paris or Rome. Great, great, great. Unfortunately, my wife and I really found out that we despised living in New York City, so I resigned a law professor assistant dean job, and we moved back to our house we'd saved, kept as for summers and for Christmas in Williamsburg. So we've been living in the Tidewater of Virginia. We've been living there off and on since 2001. My last Air Force assignment was at Langley Air Force Base, and so I lived in Williamsburg, went home to Fairfax, where my family was stayed in Northern Virginia for those last 2 years. And then Kathy and I moved down there permanently in 2006, I guess. And we've been there off and on ever since. 5 years in New York, but we spent chunks of the summer and a month over Christmas back in the Tidewater every year we were in New York, and then have been back full time in the Tidewater since 2016. So it's been 20 years off and on.
So when did writing like novels take center stage for you?
Yeah, when Kath and I decided I was going to resign from St. John's and we were going to move back to Virginia from New York City, it was my wife, whether we could all have such fabulous spouses like my wife, she turned to me and said, you've always wanted to write a novel. Why don't you take a year off and do nothing but write? We were fortunate enough to be in a position that we could afford to do that. We sold our house in Williamsburg. I had my military pension, so it afforded us an opportunity to be able to do that. And in that 1 year I took off to do nothing but write full time, I wrote about 1.6 novels, got one completely done, and one that was, I suppose, in the second draft, maybe third draft. So it was great. I absolutely loved that year. I look forward to the time when I can do that again, to be honest with you. And that was the start of 3 novels that I have published now. So.
And so how did you choose historical fiction as your genre?
Kind of a mix of reasons. First of all, I wanted to write something about soldiers coming back from war and how war changes everything and everybody, and how we individually and collectively try to put things back together again after that kind of experience. I initially was going to set it more or less present day, which would have necessitated really using Iraq and or Afghanistan as the conflict. And I got about a month into kind of preliminarily researching and sketching that out. And as a retired military guy myself, I started getting this uneasy feeling. This is 2016, so this is 6 years ago. And as I'm sure you know, Chris, at that time, the young men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, who were still coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan in 2016, hadn't really started telling their own stories yet. We're just starting to get some literature and poetry and memoir out of those experiences. I almost felt like I was taking their story before they told it. And I just was feeling uncomfortable as a veteran about that. I'd always liked historical fiction, refer back to me inappropriately reading Hawaii at age 9 or 10. And I thought, that might be the answer to this. I'd done a couple of non-law degrees in international relations, and the First World War is an unavoidable, in every international relations course you do almost, example of a colossal failure of the international system, when nations ended up in horrendous, destructive war that could have easily been avoided. So I knew a lot about the First World War from my academic background. I knew the history and I knew the major events, and I thought, I've always thought the First World War is actually more interesting than the Second World War. So I thought, I can tell every story I want to tell about what this is like coming home from war in the context of the First World War. PTSD, yeah, it was called shell shock back then, right? And it was a profound problem that was first medically identified during the First World War. People surviving catastrophic wounds on the battlefield. That was the first war where you had actually some chance of surviving catastrophic wounds on the battlefield. The crushing burden of mental health issues and addiction. There was an entire generation coming out of World War I that were alcohol addicted or dependent or abusing morphine, which is very readily available back then, actually. A lot of self-medication of the trauma of war, which certainly resonates very strongly present day. So there's so much parallelism between young men and women coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan today, and mostly young men, but some women as well, coming out of the almost indescribable and unimaginable violence and carnage of the First World War.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And with that, your Sweet Wine of Youth trilogy is a multiple award-winning trilogy. Like, what's the backdrop and the storyline behind that story?
Let me think. Well, the sort of meta theme I was going for, I guess, was 3 volumes. I wanted to, in each volume, kind of look at this big question of how war breaks everything and everybody and how we put things back together again. I wanted to look at it from 3 different lenses. The first volume, None of Us the Same, really examines that theme from the individual. It's highly personalized sort of story. I mean, all of them are very character-driven stories. That's how I write. But so the first book, I really wanted to look at this of individual impacts. The second book, Truly Are the Free, I really wanted to, again, character-driven story, but set in this overarching theme of the remarkable cultural change that emerged out of the war. Don't forget, you go from the end of the war at the end of 1918, and it's right on the cusp of the Jazz Age and flappers and prohibition and the gangster culture in America and the Roaring Twenties. So it was really incredibly enjoyable to do the research and writing around that. I got to go from telling the story of the horrors of how people survived the First World War right into the Jazz Age in New York City. And like the second book is set after the war, split between Jazz Age Harlem and avant-garde Paris after the war, and examining those great changes in culture, in art and music and literature, in what was considered acceptable behavior for women, for example. All of that was completely upended from the war. It was 4.5 years of denial and grayness and death and destruction and sadness, and people wanted beautiful things, happy music, great dancing. They wanted to enjoy life again. So that was a wonderful story arc to be able to include in Truly Are the Free. And then the third volume, No Heroes Welcome, I wanted to examine the great sort of political upheaval that happened as a result of the First World War, sort of the end of monarchies and empires. And I examined it through characters that were first introduced in the first book, the family of an Irish nurse named Deirdre Brannigan, who was main character in the first book. Went back to her family, what was happening in Dublin with her family during the time she was off at the war and afterwards. And so it takes you from 1916 and the Easter Rising in Dublin, and then the War of Independence right after the war, and then right into the Irish Civil War, and that being that first chink in the armor of the end of the British Empire. So I used Ireland as that example during the war and right after the war. Ireland is an example of the space that was opened up for enormous political upheaval and change as well. So that was a sort of big meta-thematic, if you will, arc that I tried to draw through the trilogy.
Now, I imagine being, someone who writes historical fiction, it involves a lot of research to accurately portray people. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, it does. I'm thinking back to the piles of books. Well, as I said, I already knew a lot about the big story. I knew a lot about the First World War. I knew a lot about Irish history just from prior academic and personal sort of interest reading prior to that. But what I was really only interested in writing very character-driven stories. I've read too much historical fiction that's just recitation of historical fact after historical fact, kind of strung together with weak two-dimensional characters. I didn't want to do that. I wanted just the opposite. I wanted full-blooded, three-dimensional, interesting, challenging characters moving through these events. So as Ernest Hemingway once said, your research, when you're writing, it should be like an iceberg, 90% below the waterline. And I think there's doing this mountain of research for historical fiction, there is a temptation. It's a very human temptation that I felt myself to show off your research. I can tell you, having seen that in some parts of books that I wrote myself, it makes you out to be a crashing bore. So you have to really cut back. I kept reminding myself, I kept visualizing Hemingway's iceberg of 90% below the surface. But that said, so what I wanted to do was get realistic characters, how characters would have acted and behaved and reacted in that period. So I spent a lot of time reading things like trench diaries. That was actually this little genre of writing that came out of the war, people that kept diaries during their time in the trenches. And I read some terrific British ones and Canadian, wonderful French. Poilu, an enlisted French soldier that served every day of the 50 months of the war. He served 51 months. He served in uniform. Those were marvelous. Memoirs were good sources, only I drew a hard line for myself not to read any memoirs that were written more than 10 years after the war. You get a little problem with old men's rose-colored glasses after that, I think, that they get to be a little bit too idealized. I wanted to fresh memories is what I was looking for. I'll tell you one of the best resources I found that helped me with the characters, especially the dialogue, was reading war poets, especially the British war poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, these wonderful, not all of them who survived the war, British war poets. In fact, the title of the first book is drawn from a Siegfried Sassoon poem, None of Us the Same. It was shocking and wonderful to discover this emotional arc of these, especially the ones that served from the earliest part of the war, where their earliest, if we read their poems in chronological order, and the early ones are all full of rah rah Britannia and let's save the world, small countries from these horrible Germans, and all full of enthusiasm and patriotism. And then certainly by 1916, and after the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the disillusionment and the horror and the sort of hopelessness starts to creep in and then becomes very, very pronounced by the last 2 years of the war, really. And that helped inform my character arcs, I think, probably more than anything else. YouTube and Google and other online sources can be very helpful. By the way, Google Maps, if you get the Earth view or the street view, where you can actually walk the streets of a place now, you have to, of course, imagine that this is 100 years earlier. And the Earth view in Google, you can still view the satellite views in Google of the areas along the Western Front in France. You can still see the scars of the trench lines. They're still visible from satellite view. You can see the zigzag of the trench lines. So all those resources were really, really helpful. And I just immersed myself in everything I could, everything that these characters would have personally seen, read, done, heard, touched, I wanted to do to really get a feel for that. My wife and I were in London right before I started working on that first book and spent a remarkable Monday in the Imperial War Museum in London. Almost nobody there. It was a horrible rainy day in February. And there was more staff than there were visitors. And the staff, I told them what I was doing, and they let me handle antique exhibits and answered every question I could possibly. We spent hours in each of the exhibit halls for the First World War. And I nothing could beat that. I could take I held a ration can from a First World War soldier, something like that. The feel of that and the weight of that was incomparable research for me. I couldn't research enough just because I wanted to immerse myself in this. And again, I think it then became a case of me editing and editing and editing and editing back. My mechanical methodology is to sort of overwrite. I don't know what yours is, Chris, but I tend to write too much and then cut back. And I've always been that way, even with my professional legal writing or writing briefs for a court. It's a 25-page limit. I'll write 40 pages and then cut back. So that's really kind of what it was kind of sculpting back. But that's a very long answer into how I did research.
Yeah, no, I write the same way. Like if I've got to write like a 2,000 word story, I'll write it 3,000 and then I'll just cut till I get to what I want to get to.
Don't you think that makes for sort of denser, pithier writing too?
It does. Because I think the overwriting helps you to process everything that needs to be said. And then you can figure out, okay, well, now that I've processed all that I've got to write, what's important to the audience now?
I think that's exactly correct.
Yeah. What do they need to hear and see in this story that does, and then what can I take away that's not going to affect the overall storyline?
Starting with cutting out all the adverbs, right? I'm terrible. My first drafts have way too many adverbs.
I tell you.
But I think you and I are of a mind on that. My professional writing in particular, it was very, very obvious when opposing counsel or someone was padding. When they were padding in the writing, it was very obvious. I think you get much denser, much pithier writing, both professional writing and fiction writing, by overwriting and then condense, pare it down, chop it, combine it, and you get a much richer texture, I think, to the writing.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was looking through my Audible account and through my Kindle account maybe a week or two ago, and I was noticing that almost all of my favorite like nonfiction, like biography type books were all written by journalists. And I think that it's that whole thing where I think journalists really go deep diving into the details They try to get like their hands on like press clippings. They try to find people who are like, close to eyewitness account level people, family. They'll find whatever they need to find to fill out and make the story what it needs to be. And I'm like, and I love hearing that research kind of shine through in the writing.
I could not agree more. One of my favorite, I don't read a lot of nonfiction, honestly, but probably my favorite nonfiction writer is Eric Larson. Devil in the White City, In the Garden of the Beasts. He does a book every couple of years. I think he's fabulous, got a big fan base, and I'm a proud member of it. Started out as a Wall Street Journal writer. And and you can tell he's got, there is that journalistic texture to his writing, which I think comes across very, very effectively. Devil in the White City, the story of a mass murderer loose at the White City exhibition in Chicago, the Great World's Fair in Chicago, which is apparently going to be made into a movie by Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio at some point. Beautiful, beautiful nonfiction that is, the writing is as compelling as reading fiction, reading the best fiction.
Wow.
That's an accomplishment. Now, there are some nonfiction writers out there. I think Eric Larson is probably my favorite example of that can pull that off and pull it off really, really well.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, these were all really amazing tips for research. One more thing I think that you'd mentioned to me before is that you actually travel to places and talk to people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. My first book, I think the best example of that was my first book was set about the first quarter and the last third were set in Newfoundland. How I got there is a long story, but I needed to pick a unit to put my buddies in from that first, friends that decided in the first great, burst of enthusiasm after the war broke out in August of 1914, all wanted to go off and enlist together. Happened all over the place, and I had to pick one. And the unit that I sort of regiment that I came upon that seemed most interesting to me was the Newfoundland Regiment, now the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, and I loved it because you had these young men coming from the very edge of the British Empire, right? This unspoiled island, this bucolic, wooded seacoast kind of island, then going to the colossally horrid noise and violence and mud and death and dirt and squalor of the Western Front, and then home to that beautiful, pristine, edge of the world kind of place. It was a wonderful narrative kind of device to be able to use that juxtaposition. So we went to Newfoundland to do research, made the drive up there. By the way, put it on your bucket list. It's just an amazing place, Newfoundland. And we spent 3 weeks there driving all around and talking to every Newfoundlander we could get to talk to us, which is basically everybody in Newfoundland. That is a very gregarious, sociable. I think island people everywhere are kind of like that.
Yeah.
They're hospitable and open and welcoming. As I often joked, however, that it was a little shocking for me. My wife loved it, by the way. But for me, in the Newfoundland dialect of English, there is no equivalent to TMI. There is no such thing. And you'd be talking to somebody for 3 minutes and you'd hear about, grandpa's, hemorrhoid attack from the night before or something. My wife loved that. She loved the sort of sharing thing. I had to get used to it. I was a little bit too much for me, but a marvelous place, absolutely fabulous. And we spent 3 weeks knocking around Newfoundland. I did a lot of research on cod fishing and cod schooners. That plays a part in the first book. In particular, lighthouses. There's scenes at a lighthouse in the first book, and I need to learn a lot about lighthouses. And there's a marvelous lighthouse museum in Newfoundland in Buena Vista. Another one of those days where it was raining and nobody was there, and there was my wife and I and 3 staff. So the staff again outnumbered us, and we spent probably 6 or 7 hours in that lighthouse and the keeper's house and talking with the staff, and again letting us go behind the scenes. And I got to wind the lighthouse light. It was really remarkable. It was a old-fashioned lighthouse. It wasn't electrified, and the way they used to rotate the light was like a big grandfather clock. Had a huge weight with a big chain that went all the way up to the top of the lighthouse, and you'd crank that up, and it would spin the light for about 12 hours. So you had to wind it twice a day, and they let me wind the lighthouse one time. So I was really impressed by the kind of enormous generosity of people when I would sheepishly explain, I'm working on this book, it's kind of, and they would be so excited and so supportive. And just incredibly generous with their time. And certainly in Newfoundland, we found that Newfoundlanders are just remarkably open and friendly. and welcoming people. And I cannot wait to get back. My wife and I have been saying we were saying that when COVID broke out, we were saying that, but we will hopefully get back there. I've got an open invitation to do one of these interviews with the CBC affiliate in St. John's. I'd love to go back and do the radio interview there and knock around some more.
Yeah. My wife would definitely appreciate a trip there. She's always had this fascination with Nana, Peter Pan's dog, who happens to be a Newfoundland.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So she would love that. It's like, yeah, I just want to see all the dogs.
Yeah, it's a weird thing with the Newfoundlander that Newfie is the nickname for the dog. And a lot of Americans call Newfoundland people Newfies, and that is, at least until probably the last 5 or 10 years, was considered kind of an insult. Now they've kind of owned it themselves.
Oh, okay.
And so they kind of call themselves Newfies now, and just sort of own the insult, right? But yeah, it's actually, you can drive up there. It's remarkable. You can drive up, up through Massachusetts and Maine, and then you drive across Nova Scotia and get the ferry. Drive your car onto a ferry, and you wake up the next morning in Newfoundland. So.
Wow. So let's talk about character a little bit,
Sure.
'cause I imagine that, you're a masterful at developing character because you spend a lot of time researching. Talk about, how you do that. Like, how do you develop your characters so they're not these two-dimensional, like, characters on page?
It's interesting. I've had some interesting encounters with my characters. I heard people say a lot of writers go on about their characters and, how their characters speak to them. And I always thought that was a sort of new agey kind of touchy-feely nonsense. Well, until one of them quit talking to me, I panicked. Oh my God, what happened to Will Parsons' voice? I can't hear him anymore. I mean, I start with characters. I started with the basic, with the big thematic idea of what I was after, and then I populated that with what kinds of characters do I need to tell this story and to be interesting characters in and of themselves. The First World War was hard in some ways because you'll find out, and I succumbed to it as well, that if you want to have a woman protagonist in the war, you're kind of stuck with a very limited category of types. And I got a nurse. There's a lot of World War I nurses in these stories because that's where the most women would have been: nurses and ambulance drivers and Red Cross volunteers and that sort of thing, because there weren't any women soldiers at that time. So I do have an Irish nurse and my Newfoundland pals, and they kind of grew themselves in some ways. It was my Irish nurse, Deirdre Brannigan. I was probably in about the 4th revision of that first book, and I turned to my wife, who, by the way, is also my editor, and said, Deirdre Brannigan, she's a lot like all the Irish women in my family, my great aunts and my grandmothers. And, that's kind of interesting. My wife looks at me and says, "It took you this long to figure that out? You didn't know this before?" And the answer was no, I was that clueless. But these characters emerge in sort of composite fashion. What I did with that first book, for example, was I had to break them. That's the point, right? How did the war affect them? It affects everybody in some way. So how am I going to break them? And that sets up some of the way the character develops. If I'm going to break this character with not being able to shake off a morphine addiction, how do I set that up so the stakes on that are so high? You want to really have high stakes for these things. So I set up a character who's this very strong, very self-sufficient person who, fears nothing or no one, and the war grinds on her so hard. All of the witnessing of the death and the destruction and the blood and the horrible wounds, it wears on her so much that she sort of inadvertently falls into addiction, and what that does to her and how she crawls out of it on the back end. So the narrative needs of the story and sort of fill out the basic sketch of the character, I think. And, you have to like them even if they're bad. Yeah, I love my bad guys. I mean, the bad guys are wonderful. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making much sense out of this. Their dialogue was probably the part I spent the most time really being concerned about. I wanted pithy, believable dialogue. And that was one thing in particular that I really tried to capture for each character. And with each revision of the manuscript, I cut more and more dialogue. That's parts of the book that I really spent a lot of time concentrating on, paring down to the essentials. Some of that may be the influence of all the Hemingway I read all my life. I mean, Hemingway was famous for his staccato writing, particularly dialogue. I think it worked. One of the comments I've gotten from most frequently from readers and reviewers was the dialogue is really believable. Okay. By the way, when you write dialogue, do you read it out loud to yourself?
I'm not a fiction writer, so I don't
So you
really,
don't write dialogue.
I don't write a lot of dialogue. Everything I write is direct quotes.
I thought you did. I'm sorry. I thought you wrote some fiction too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I cannot imagine not reading your book out loud to yourself when it's in manuscript form. That's how, and particularly how you can tell if your dialogue is starting to sound tinny or artificial, is reading it out loud. So yeah, I read after the second draft, I would read my books out loud. That was the process from going from the second to the third draft for me, was to read it out loud and make revisions from that.
And so when you're reading out loud, are you hearing the characters in their dialect? Like, are you writing in their dialect, or like how does that come out? Where like the Irish nurse sounds like an Irish nurse?
Yeah,
You know?
that's a really interesting question. That's a multi-layered problem. I was on a steep learning curve with that on my first book. So I had my main characters were two Newfoundland guys and an Irish woman. So initially, the first draft of that book, I tried to write their dialogue in phonetically correct dialect, and it was unreadable. It was awful. So between the first and the second draft on that one, I said, I gotta forget this nonsense. What I ended up doing with the Newfoundlanders was adopting a handful of sort of flag words that are very, very typical to Newfoundland dialect. Diana Gabaldon does this with her Outlander books. That she has a basket of broad Scots words that she uses regularly to denote this is a Scottish character speaking. I adopted something like that, although I hadn't read Diana Gabaldon at the time. I discovered this after I wrote the book, that I read her books. So, for example, in Newfoundland dialect, almost every sentence you in conversation you end with the word by, B''y, which is just an abbreviation of boy. So by, oh, it's a beautiful day today, by, eh? Or, how's she cutting by, something like that. It's a throwaway word. It's all over in the Newfoundland dialect, and it's even now become gender neutral. You call women by as well as men by. Wasn't back then. I actually had to work with that. So I mostly did that using sort of flag words to indicate. And for the Irish characters, I grew up in an Irish American family, and where I just listen to people talk and tell stories all the time. And there is, even generations later in an Irish American family, I think there's a certain rhythm to the way people talk. But I try to do, the Irish have a particular rhythm and word order when they're speaking English that is influenced by Irish Gaelic idiom. And, this guy had too much to drink. Oh, he had too much of the drink taken. Sort of a unique word order like that, plus the rhythm. Irish Hibernian English, as they would call it, Irish accented and dialected English, has a very musical cadence to it, a very rhythmic cadence to it. And so I tried to capture the feel of that rhythm of the language, the love of talking, the love of telling stories that the Irish have, and a little bit of the peculiar word order I shouldn't say peculiar, unique word order that the Irish use when they're speaking English. So that made it a lot lighter touch, made it readable, not as clunky, not pretentious. When I was trying to write sort of phonetically correct dialect, it was rather pretentious.
Yeah, it's almost like reading. It's almost like when you're trying to learn some of the Romantic languages, the kind of the subject, object, verb.
Very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it became a different problem in my second book. My second book, it's two pairs of main characters, a brother and a sister, and two lovers, boyfriend, girlfriend. The brother and sister were African Americans raised in a professional family. Their father was a doctor in Harlem before the war. And this especially tracks the story after the war, brought us to Jazz Age Harlem. The problem with that was the brother was went to war with 369th U.S. Infantry, the famous Harlem's Hellfighters. So he's surrounded by African American characters, right? And in fact, the white guy of the couple is a white officer assigned to the Harlem Hellfighters, which is historically correct, and it was a way to get these two characters into an intimate collegial friendship, life and death sort of relationship. So how do I, as a middle-aged white guy, write African American characters dialogue who are everything from the highly educated son of an African American, of a black lawyer in Harlem, to a guy who's a semi-literate son of a sharecropper from North Carolina, and everything in between? That was a challenge and a cause of a large amount of perspiration on my part. And that also ran me smack dab into the very, very hot topic among writers of cultural appropriation. And here there be troubled waters, as you know, I'm sure, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely.
The way I resolved, I went through some serious panic attacks doing this as well. What finally resolved it in my mind was I adopted these rules that don't use a cross-cultural, a character from outside your broad culture, if you will, without a legitimate narrative purpose. So nothing gratuitous, no gratuitous Black or South Asian or Native American or whatever characters. There has to be a good narrative purpose for it. But, there shouldn't be anything gratuitous in your writing, period. But particularly in this area, no gratuitous characters. Write them with respect and humility. You don't know everything about this cultural experience firsthand, and you need to treat these characters respectfully. And that doesn't mean I felt like I had to have only good Black characters. I have some pretty despicable Black characters in Truly Are the Free, but I wrote them with respect and with humility, I think. And I got through it okay. That, if you put a gun to my head and made me tell you which was my favorite of those three books, it's probably the second one. Maybe that's because I had so much struggle with it. It's been pretty well received, so I think maybe I hit it about right. But boy, that was stressful for me. But it's a story I felt like I had to tell.
Right. And you mentioned, earlier that, when you like to write, you like to have these token phrases or things that are key indicators of a person's culture. Do you do that same thing when you're writing about African American characters? Do you have key indicators, like when you're talking about the educated African American man versus the Southern African American man who's going to sound completely different?
Yeah, not so much directly, mostly because having grown up in the United States, I've grown up exposed to, I guess what you call Black American dialect or speech, and from different parts of the country. So I was more familiarity with it, certainly, than like Newfoundland, right? But what I ended up doing was just, again, focusing on word choice. And a lot of times you would use, in the context of lesser educated characters, white or Black for that reason, you use a lot of things, signals like instead of ing at the end of a word, you put in apostrophe. Instead of talking, you're talking. To give that's kind of a real flag, I think, in writing English, especially with American characters, of a level of education. I think that's kind of a tell that people are used to seeing in writing. This guy's a country person. He's a farmer. He's from a rural area. He's not real well educated if he says talking and walking and thinking rather than talking and walking and thinking. So I think that was useful. But that was kind of a stylistic thing that I think most readers are used to identifying. Appropriate vocabulary is a big one. Profanity is an interesting piece, not just for Black characters, but for all the characters. And I actually use profanity judiciously, again, nothing gratuitous, but use it as an indicator of, like, the better educated characters sinking into kind of despair and fear. I wrote a blog post a couple of years ago that got a lot of play, actually, about the origins of the F-bomb. And the regular use of that word really ramped up and became part of the culture in the First World War, in the trenches of the First World War. So the profanity even was useful to not necessarily show sort of social class or educational level, but to use as a way to reinforce how things were changing with these characters. One of the main characters from the first book, Will Parsons, wouldn't have F-bombed if his life depended on it in 1914, but by 1918, he was dropping them regularly. So
Yeah, and as far as
useful in that regard.
right. As far as readers, as readers go, how adept are readers at capturing or catching inaccuracies in character portrayal, that to the point where an author needs to be very cognizant of that while they write?
Yeah, I haven't had any of that blow back on me much. The only thing I got with my first book, and this actually affected the way I wrote Irish characters in the second and third book, was a reviewer from the Historical Novel Society, Historical Novel Reviews magazine, read the first book, and the reviewer was from Dublin, was from Ireland, and loved the book, but said perhaps the Irish characters were a bit too Irish. She literally wrote Oirish, a bit too Irish. And I actually asked another writer friend of mine who had read the book and done a review for me. I said, what do you think? Yeah, she may be right there. I didn't say anything about it, but yeah, they might have been a little bit too St. Patrick's Day leprechaun-y. So I don't think it really hurt the book much, but especially for an Irish reader in Dublin, she said, I think it was a she, said, yeah, it might be a little too. And I took that to heart and really tried to tone that down a bit, adjusted the way I had them talk and the way I had them interact a bit for book 2 and book 3. Book 3, I think I got it right. That's almost entirely set in Dublin. The third book, most of it set inside the walls of a pub. The third book, I really wanted to go from these big, broad, worldwide, sweeping landscapes I was writing about, Paris and New York and Newfoundland and France. And I wanted it to be a very intimate setting. So a big chunk of that third book is set inside the walls of a pub called the Gallant Fusilier. And I really wanted it to be that kind of an intimate setting. So, I think you need to be open to getting stuff not quite right and adjusting your writing as well. So.
Yeah, and do you use beta readers for reading dialogue like that? Like, if you've got an African American character or you've got a character
always.
from Ireland or wherever, do you have beta readers who just look for that, who are acclimated to the culture?
If I can find them, yes, I certainly do. Newfoundlander, yep. Black, yep. Irish, yep. British, yep. found some, French, French speaker, yeah. I had my wife put together a team of beta readers, what she called a virtual beta book club, that read the fourth draft of each book. Anywhere from 5 to 7 beta readers who are all very generous with their time. The native French speaker beta reader I had for the second book, I guess there was a lot of it set in Paris, and the French characters are a whole different problem, how you write their dialogue. I really wanted a native French speaker to beta that, and this reader was remarkably generous. Spent hours on the phone with me, reworking some dialogue of French characters, and she and I, we sort of mentally walking parts of Paris together. I don't think you've got this quite right physically. That isn't exactly where that is. I did a lot of that, which is marvelous. I just absolutely love that kind of reaction and interaction with readers. So yeah, I think beta readers are wonderful. First draft, each book that I've published is the 6th draft. First draft is mine alone. Nobody else in the world sees that. That's just shoveling sand in the sandbox from which I will create beautiful castles through many revisions. But it's ugly sand to begin with. So first draft is mine. Second draft, my wife would read the second draft. Third draft, between the second and third draft, I would read it out loud to myself, and 2 of my 3 adult children would read it. I wanted another generational read on all my books. And believe me, my kids have never had any problems criticizing their father. So I think I got straight talk from them. So third revision then was my wife again. And then the fourth, my wife and I both would do the third revision after notes from my kids. And then that fourth draft would go out to beta readers. Fifth draft incorporated comments from the beta readers. And then that fifth draft was the final proof. My wife would get that for the last final proofread, and that got us to sixth draft, and that's what was published each time. So done okay. I mean, the beauty with print on demand and ebooks is you can correct things after it's published. Just kind of nice.
It's very forgiving.
So we've always found a couple, no more than 2 or 3 post-publication mistakes that we went back and changed the master files for the print on demand and for the ebooks. But that's not bad, especially for, we indie-publish these books.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get down to 2 or 3 mistakes in 350 pages, that's pretty good. That is as good as a major publishing house.
That's exceptional.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now talk to me about proximity. Talk to me about proximity a little bit. Just can an author who wants to write ethnic characters do so successfully without any proximity, like without having any close relationships to maybe a Latino character or a Black character or an Asian character? Can they successfully do it without access?
I'm not sure. I think the answer would be it depends, but it depends on a lot. Let me give you, there's a lot of, people don't really realize, I think, a lot of times, we're not very good at introspection about this in a lot of respects. I think we see other people doing this wrong, but we don't see ourselves doing it wrong, which is why I was particularly nervous about this with my second book. I was at a writer's conference 4 or 5 years ago, maybe. And one of the lunch and keynote speakers was a woman author who was a South Asian American. Parents were South Asian immigrants. And she gave a very full-throated, very intense, and very well thought out condemnation to a room of 300 writers at this writers' conference of, don't write my culture. Don't you white people try to write South Asian stories, South Asian characters and South Asian stories. And it was remarkably powerful, the speech she gave. That was about the first 2/3. The last third of her speech, the writers' conference had asked her to talk about her upcoming book that was about to be published. And it was about a South Asian character, a woman, who was had a physical disability. And after the first 2/3 of this presentation was about, don't you dare write my culture, she then told us with quite enthusiastically and excited to tell the story about how when she was visiting in the summer her relatives in South Asia, she masqueraded as someone who couldn't walk and went out on the street and was so excited because an old man who had been disabled all his life came up and was sort of like talking to her and saying, oh, it's so good to see another disabled person. And she was so thrilled that she had fooled this old disabled man. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, you showed so much thought in the first 2/3 of this presentation, and you didn't get the fact that that was incredibly offensive what you did. And having, in my professional life, done a lot of work with persons with disabilities advocacy groups through international development projects I'd worked on in different countries, there is nobody that are more radical self-advocates than persons with disabilities. And they would be, I guarantee you, aghast at what she said. But because she was doing it herself for what she thought was an important narrative and research purpose for her upcoming novel, she didn't see it. She didn't see just exactly how hypocritical what she just said was. So I don't say this to just say this is some bad person. I think it's very descriptive of how a lot of us find ourselves in these positions. That, oh, well, these people, they're offensive and they do this stuff wrong, but I wouldn't possibly do that. What I struggled with in my second book is the mere act of creating these characters that are not the same race as me, irredeemably offensive. And there's a fair argument that is made regularly about that. I'm not convinced by it. Again, I go back to, as long as you have a legitimate narrative purpose, a legitimate literary purpose for doing this, it's not gratuitous, and you do it with respect and some humility. I think that's okay. So there is a middle way, I think. It's careful. You got to pick your way carefully through it, though. And I beat myself up a lot, sort of with anxiety and have I got this right when I was doing it. So I don't know. That's maybe not a perfect answer, but it's the one that I can live with.
No, that's a great story, and that's a great example because you're right. We don't always look inwardly at what we're doing. We can always point out the mistakes of others, but it's always hard to shine that spotlight back at ourselves. And I think it's
uncomfortable. I managed to shine that spotlight back on myself, and man, it's uncomfortable to be in it. I luckily, again, my wife was very much involved in these projects with me, and we talked about it endlessly. And I talked to friends, white friends, black friends, and just I'm really struggling with this. And I got a lot of good support and feedback. And, that's where I got this, go at this respectfully and with a little humility. A lot of people from other cultures or races than me gave me that advice. Go at this with respect and with humility. And I think that's probably the most important rule right there.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I had to write a piece about the concept of white privilege, to write a story about that. And I struggled. I didn't even want to be the writer of the story. And I had to be convinced by my editor to write the story. It's like, there's nobody better to write the story. You have to do this. Please do this. And I was like,
yeah.
I reluctantly took it. And I was like, well, how do I write this in a way that's not disparaging to one race and far too uplifting or excusatory to another race? And how do I bridge
Sure.
the gap and make it so that everybody feels like they have a little bit of the blame in this, and we have a long ways to go, and we can work together to fix it. And that was kind of like my underlying way of trying to write the story. Like, I've got to write it in a way that's not going to leave somebody feeling out in the dark.
Yeah. Well, and you were in another layer of complexity that I didn't find myself in, which was you were writing about the historically dominant race and culture. I was in this the opposite. I wasn't writing about the historically, sort of oppressed race and culture.
Right.
And that's a tough, in some ways that's even harder, I think.
Yeah.
As you said, you don't want to come across as being this sort of accusatory or, descending into kind of parody. And that's tough both ways, I think. I always read my dialogue out loud. My second book, I read all of the dialogue for the Black Characters Netbook. I must have read all of that dialogue 6 or 8 times. Because I was so afraid I was going to be perceived as sort of falling into some sort of Aunt Jemima speak and, so step and fetch it sounding characters. And I absolutely was not going to do that. Read it out loud a lot and really worked very, very hard on that dialogue to not have any kind of minstrelly kind of sound to it, because that would be death for the book, I thought. So I was very careful about that.
Yeah. And so I guess in closing, what piece of advice or what few pieces of advice would you leave for writers who want to explore writing ethnic characters and want to do it well?
I would say, first of all, don't be afraid to explore. And then if through your exploration, you determine you've got a legitimate literary need to tell your story through some characters that are not of your own culture, religion, race, nationality, ethnicity, do so. But again, never do so gratuitously. Always have a compelling literary purpose for doing what you're doing, and always approach it with humility and with respect. That's probably the best advice I can give. And to me, actually having some black characters in my second book who were evil characters was approaching them with respect. I think only having good, happy, wonderful black characters as a white author is offensive, because it's not real. It's not real people. So, I approach my black villains and my white villains with respect, but I didn't avoid it. Just did it carefully and with respect.
Yeah, and that's the smart approach, I think. Just like you said, not to avoid it and do it well and do it right. Well, thanks for your time today, Jeffrey. It was great to talk about character and dialogue and just how to write with you. It's been fun.
And you too, Chris. It's always a pleasure talking with you, and hope we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely, man. Best of luck on all your writing endeavors.
And you too.
How's that for inspiring? I hope you take action on one thing you learned in today's episode. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast and left a review on iTunes, I want to encourage you to do that too. Finally, be sure to visit chrisjonesinc.com to sign up for updates. Don't worry, I won't spam you. And we'll see you back here next week for another episode.